The smell of sawdust never really leaves a man. Even now, 30 years after I sold the company, I can still walk into my garage workshop on a Tuesday morning, run my hand along a piece of red oak, and feel something settle inside my chest that nothing else in this world can touch. My son used to say I talk to the wood more than I talk to people. He wasn't wrong. Wood doesn't interrupt you. Wood doesn't tell you what you should have been. I turned 67 last March. My wife passed 4 years ago, a little over a month before what would have been our 40th anniversary. Pancreatic cancer, 11 weeks from diagnosis to the end. I won't spend time on that here because some things don't belong in a story like this, but I mention it because it matters. When you lose someone like that, you stop pretending. You stop tolerating things you used to tolerate because you think time is unlimited. You stop performing patience for people who have never earned it. My son is 34 years old. He has his mother's eyes and her stubbornness, which I mean is the highest compliment I know how to give. He works in commercial finance, evaluating risk, structuring deals, advising mid-sized companies on acquisitions. He is good at it, very good. He didn't get that from me. I built things with my hands and my crew. He builds things with spreadsheets and relationships. Different tools, same philosophy. You show up. You do what you say you'll do. You don't cut corners when nobody's watching. He met his fiancée 2 years ago at a conference in Chicago. She was working for her father's investment firm at the time, handling their communications portfolio. She is smart and well-spoken, and the first time I met her, I liked her. She laughed at something I said about a miter saw, and the laugh was real, not performed. I thought, this is a good woman. My son has chosen well. Her father is a different matter entirely. I met him for the first time at a dinner about 8 months after my son and his daughter got serious. The restaurant was in the kind of neighborhood where the parking valets look at your car before they look at you. I drove my truck. The valet didn't hide his expression fast enough. I didn't mind. I've been driving trucks my whole life, and I'll drive one to my grave. Her father was already seated when we arrived. He stood when we approached the table, and the handshake he gave me was the kind that tells you everything firm enough to assert, brief enough to dismiss. He was 62, silver-haired, the type of man who has never in his life wondered whether his suit was appropriate for the occasion because his suits are always appropriate for the occasion. He owned a regional investment firm, sat on 3 nonprofit boards, had a club membership I'd heard of but never sought, and had that particular way of asking questions that is really just a vehicle for making statements about himself. Over dinner, he asked what I did. I told him I was retired. He asked from what? I said, construction. He nodded the way people nod when they're already thinking about the next thing they want to say. He talked about the market. He talked about interest rates. He asked my son several questions that I noticed, without being obvious about noticing, were designed to establish exactly how much of his own father's success my son could take credit for. My son answered honestly and without defensiveness. I was proud of him. I said very little that evening. I asked a few questions. I listened more than I spoke. This is not a skill I was born with. It is something my wife taught me, mostly by example, over the course of 4 decades. She used to say that people reveal everything they are if you give them enough silence to fill. She was right about that, as she was right about most things. By the end of the night, I had a fairly complete picture of the man. He was not cruel, exactly. He was something more common, and in some ways more dangerous than cruelty. He was a man who had organized the entire world into a hierarchy, and had never once questioned whether the hierarchy was real, or whether he had simply been lucky enough to be born near the top of it, and smart enough to stay there. Everything was ranked. Everything was evaluated. People were assets, or they were liabilities. My son, because of his profession and his trajectory, was being evaluated as a potential asset. I, because of my truck and my calluses and my retirement from a trade, had already been categorized and filed. I didn't lose sleep over it. I've been categorized before. I know what I am and I know what I've built, and none of it requires his validation. The wedding was planned for late September. My son's fiancée wanted something in the countryside, a restored estate property about 40 miles outside the city. The kind of place with original stonework and a ceremony lawn that backed up to a tree line the kind of place you see in magazines. It was beautiful. I visited it once with my son, and I understood immediately why she'd chosen it. Her father was covering the majority of the expenses, and he made sure everyone knew it. Not loudly, not crudely, but consistently. My son asked me to cover the rehearsal dinner, which I was happy to do, and I began making those arrangements in the spring. The trouble started, as trouble often does, with a phone call I wasn't expecting on a Wednesday afternoon in early August. I was in the workshop. I had a piece of walnut clamped to the bench, and I was fitting a dovetail joint for a cabinet I was building for my son's new house, a wedding gift, something he could pass down. The kind of thing you make when you have time and love and decent tools. My phone was on the shelf above the workbench, and when it rang, I saw it was her father calling. I answered. He was pleasant at first. He asked how I was. He asked about my summer. He had the voice of a man who does not make difficult phone calls often because he usually has someone else to make them for him, and who is therefore slightly over-rehearsed when he has to do it himself. I could hear it. The pauses were too precise. The warmth was too controlled. Then he got to the point. He said he'd been thinking about the guest list. He said that with the venue having a capacity of 250, and with their family's social and professional circles being what they were in a situation where every seat carried a certain weight. He used that word, weight. He said he wanted to speak frankly with me because he respected me, and I noted, without saying so, that this was the first time in 8 months of knowing each other that he had said anything of the sort, and that, frankly, there were a number of people on my side of the guest list that gave him some concern. I let him continue. He said he wasn't questioning anyone's character, of course. But there was a professional dimension to this wedding that I might not fully appreciate. Business relationships, investor relationships. The kind of people who would be in that room had certain expectations about the environment, about the caliber of the other guests, about the overall impression the event would make. He had worked very hard to build a reputation in this city. And this wedding was, whether anyone liked it or not, also a professional occasion. He paused. Then he said, "Some of the names on my list, my old crew, my foreman of 22 years, my neighbors, my friends from the neighborhood I grew up in, might make certain attendees uncomfortable." I said, "I see." He said he hoped I could understand his position. I said, "I understand it." He said he thought perhaps we could trim my side of the guest list down to close family only, and that this would be the most elegant solution for everyone involved. I said, "I appreciate you calling me directly." He said he knew it wasn't an easy conversation, and he valued my maturity in handling it. I said, "Have a good evening." I hung up the phone. I stood at my workbench for a moment. The walnut was still clamped in place, waiting. The dovetail joint was halfway finished. I looked at it for a long time. Then I put down my tools, walked inside, made a cup of coffee, and sat at the kitchen table. I am not a man who shouts. I have raised my voice perhaps a dozen times in my adult life, and I can remember every single occasion, and not one of them was worth it. Anger is just noise. What you do with what you feel is the only thing that matters. I sat at that table and I thought carefully. Not about revenge. I want to be clear about that. What I thought about was my son. I thought about the kind of man my son had become. I thought about the kind of life he was stepping into. I thought about my old foreman, who had worked alongside me for over 2 decades, who had attended my wife's funeral and wept openly and without embarrassment, who had taught my son how to throw a baseball when my son was 7 years old and I was working too many hours. I thought about him sitting at home, waiting for a wedding invitation that this man had decided he was not important enough to receive. I thought about the word my son's future father-in-law had used. Weight. Every seat carries weight. I thought, yes, that's exactly right. I finished my coffee. I went back to my phone. I didn't call my son. I didn't call her father back. I made 3 calls that evening, 3 quiet calls to 3 people I had known for a combined total of over 90 years. The first call was to a man I'll refer to as my oldest business partner. We sold our construction company together 17 years ago. We had built it from 2 men and a pickup truck to a regional firm with over 200 employees. When we sold it, we didn't spend the money. We invested it carefully and carefully. Over the years, We had accumulated a collection of real estate holdings across the metro area: commercial properties, historic buildings, event spaces, including, as it happened, a minority stake in the holding company that owned and operated the estate venue where the wedding was scheduled to take place. Not majority, not controlling, but enough to have a conversation. My business partner is a patient man. I explained the situation. He listened without interrupting. When I was finished, he said, "What do you want to do?" I told him I didn't want to cause a scene. I didn't want anyone hurt. But I wanted it known, quietly, within the appropriate channels, that I had concerns about the venue's management of its private event agreements, and that I thought a review of their current contracts was warranted. He said he understood. He said he would make some calls in the morning. The second call was to a man I've known since we were 19 years old. He retired 3 years ago from a regional catering operation he had built from a single food truck into a company that handled over 400 events per year. His company was the exclusive caterer for the estate venue. Not his personally anymore, he'd sold it, but his son runs it now, and his son grew up in my son's backyard, and there is a kind of loyalty in relationships like that which no contract can replicate or replace. I did not ask him to cancel anything. I asked him to look carefully at the terms of the service agreement for an event scheduled for the last Saturday of September and to determine whether the contract had been executed properly, whether all the deposits had been processed through the correct accounts, whether the required insurance certifications were current and appropriately filed. The kind of thing that, if not in order, would require the caterer to place the contract under review pending resolution. He said he would look into it. The third call was to a woman I had worked with for years, a commercial florist who designed the installations for several of the landmark properties in our real estate portfolio. She was the preferred vendor for the estate venue. She was also one of the sharpest people I have ever known in my life, and she had been a friend since before my wife got sick. When I explained what had happened, she was quiet for a moment, and then she said, very simply, "I will handle my piece." I thanked all three of them. I went to bed. I slept better than I had in weeks. What I did not do was tell my son. I want to be clear about this too, because it matters. My son is an honest man. If I had told him what I was doing, he would have felt obligated to stop me, or to intervene, or to try to fix it some other way. That is not his burden to carry. This was between me and the man who called me on a Wednesday afternoon and told me my friends were not important enough to sit in the same room as his business contacts. This was between me and him, and I intended to settle it quietly. 3 days later, my son called me. His voice was measured, but I could hear something underneath it, not panic. Exactly. Confusion. He said something strange had happened with the wedding venue. They had received a letter indicating that due to an administrative review of their current event contracts, the estate was placing all upcoming bookings under temporary hold, pending the resolution of a compliance matter related to their operating license. The hold was expected to last between 3 and 6 weeks. The wedding date fell inside the hold window. My son said he didn't understand it. He said his future father-in-law was furious. He said they were already looking at alternative venues, but the wedding was 8 weeks away, and every comparable space in the area was booked. I asked my son how he was doing. He said he was managing. He said his fiancée was upset, but holding it together. He said her father had been on the phone all morning trying to reach someone at the venue who could explain the situation. I said, "These things happen sometimes. I'm sorry you're dealing with it." He said he appreciated that. He asked if I'd spoken to her father recently. I said, "He called me last week, yes." My son went quiet for a moment. Then he said, "What did he call about?" I said, "He wanted to talk about the guest list." Another silence, longer this time. My son said, "What did he say about the guest list?" I told him, not dramatically, not with bitterness. I simply told him what the man had said, in the words he had used, including the part about the caliber of guests and the professional impression the wedding needed to make, and the suggestion that my foreman and my neighbors and my lifelong friends be removed from the list because they might make certain attendees uncomfortable. I heard my son breathe. He didn't say anything for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice was different, quieter. The way a person sounds when something has shifted in them that they hadn't expected to shift. He said that to you. I said, he did. He said, and you didn't tell me. I said, I'm telling you now. What happened over the following week was not something I orchestrated entirely. I want to be honest about that. Some of it was the natural consequence of things I had set in motion, but some of it was its own momentum, independent of me, because when a man of his disposition runs into an obstacle he cannot simply spend his way past, something in him becomes visible that he usually keeps hidden. He made calls to every venue in the region. He was turned away from 4 of them. 2 had genuine conflicts. 2 had heard through the professional network about the compliance situation at the estate and were cautious about associating with an event connected to it, even peripherally. He pressured the caterer to transfer their agreement to a new venue immediately. The caterer's son reviewed the contract and found 2 discrepancies in the insurance documentation. He sent a formal notice indicating the contract was under review. Her father threatened legal action. The caterer's son, who had grown up watching his own father build a business from nothing and protect it through honest work, did not back down. The florist quietly informed the venue's event coordinator that she would be unable to fulfill the floral installation contract under the current administrative circumstances. Her inventory had already been allocated to other events, pending resolution. Within 10 days, the wedding, as it had been planned, in the venue that had been chosen, with the vendors that had been contracted, with a social impression that had been so carefully engineered, no longer existed. Not canceled, not postponed, simply dissolved. The way a structure dissolves when you remove the load-bearing elements one by one. Her father knew something was wrong. He is not a stupid man. He understood that this was not coincidence. He called me. I answered. He said, I think we need to talk. I said, I think you're right. He said, I'm going to be direct with you. I said, please do. He said he believed I had used my connections to interfere with the wedding plans. He said he found it petty and vindictive and that he had done nothing wrong. He said he had simply tried to have a professional conversation with me about a logistical challenge and that I had apparently decided to make it personal. I said, you called me to tell me that the people I have loved for 40 years are not good enough to attend my son's wedding. You used the word caliber. You used the phrase, make certain attendees uncomfortable. You did this because you looked at me and saw a retired tradesman and assumed that I had no standing to push back. He said, I was trying to manage a complicated situation. I said, no. You were managing your image. There's a difference. He was quiet. I said, I have spent 40 years building things. Not portfolios, not impressions, buildings, relationships. I have a foreman who worked beside me for 22 years and attended my wife's funeral and never once asked me for anything except fair pay and honest work. I have neighbors who brought food to my door every week for 2 months after she passed. These are not liabilities on a guest list. These are the people who made my life. And you called me on a Wednesday afternoon and told me they were a problem. He said, I understand you're upset. I said, I'm not upset. I'm clear. There's a difference there, too. He said, what do you want? I said, I want you to understand something. Not for my sake, for your daughter's sake, and for my son's sake. The kind of man who evaluates his own family by their professional utility is the kind of man who will eventually apply that evaluation to everyone, including the people he claims to love. Your daughter is a good woman. She deserves to build a life with my son without a foundation of that kind of thinking underneath it. He was quiet for a long time. Whatever he had expected from this conversation, it wasn't this. He had expected demands, conditions, a negotiation. Men like him understand negotiations. They don't always understand when someone is simply telling them the truth. He said, I owe you an apology. I said, yes, you do. He said, I apologize. I said, I accept it. What I didn't know, and what I only learned later, was that my son's fiancée had been listening. She had been in the next room of her father's house when he made the call to me. She had not intended to listen. She had come downstairs to get water and heard her father's voice and the particular tone he used when he believed he was in control of a conversation, and she had stood in the hallway, and listened to his side of the exchange. And then, when the call ended, she had walked into the room and looked at her father and asked him what he had said to me on that Wednesday night 3 weeks before. She told my son about it later that evening. She drove to our house, to the house where my son had been raised, where his mother had planted the garden that I still tend every spring, where the workshop smells like sawdust, and the kitchen table has sat in the same corner for 27 years, and she sat across from me and my son at that kitchen table, and she told me what she had heard. She said, "He told you that your friends weren't the right caliber of people." I said, "Yes." She said, "And you didn't yell at him. You didn't tell my son. You just handled it." I said, "I thought it needed handling." She looked at me for a long moment. Her eyes are dark and direct, like her father's in some ways, but where his eyes are always calculating, hers were simply present, paying attention. She said, "My whole life, I watched my father move people around, like pieces on a board. Business associates, vendors, employees, neighbors. Everyone was positioned. Everyone had a function. And I knew it, on some level. But I told myself it was just how the business world works. That it was separate from the personal. That at home, with us, he was different." She stopped. She looked at her hands. She said, "He wasn't different with you. He applied the same logic to the man who is going to be my son's grandfather someday. And that I cannot accept." My son reached across the table and took her hand. He didn't say anything. He didn't need to. I said, "Your father is not a bad man. He is a man who learned a particular way of seeing the world and never had reason to question it. Some men go their whole lives that way. Some of them get a moment that interrupts the pattern. Whether he does anything with this one is up to him." She nodded. I said, "I want you to know something. When I made those calls, I wasn't trying to blow up your wedding. I was trying to protect something. Not my pride. My son. And the idea that the life he's building deserves a foundation that isn't rotten underneath it." She said, "I know." She said, "I've been thinking about that word he used. Important. He said he only wanted important people at the wedding, and I've been sitting with that all week, thinking about what it actually means." I said, "What did you decide?" She said, "I decided that my father's version of important and mine are completely different things, and I'm done pretending they're the same." The wedding was replanned. Not at the estate, at a different venue, a simple outdoor pavilion at a state park, the kind of place with picnic tables and string lights and no valet parking. The kind of place where a man can show up in his truck and nobody looks at his vehicle before they look at his face. My foreman was there, and my neighbors, and the people who showed up with food when my wife died. Her father came too. He shook my foreman's hand and he didn't make any assessments I could see. Or if he made them, he kept them to himself, which in my experience is close enough to growth that it counts for something. The ceremony was in the late afternoon. The light came through the trees at that angle it only hits in September, the kind of light that makes everything look the way you want to remember it. My son stood at the end of the aisle, and I stood beside him for a moment before I took my seat, and he put his hand on my shoulder and he said, "I know what you did." I said, "I don't know what you're talking about." He smiled. He has his mother's smile. He has had it since he was 3 years old, and it has never once failed to reach all the way inside me and rearrange something. He said, "Thank you, Dad." I sat down. The music started. His bride came down the aisle, and she was beautiful in the simple way that things are beautiful when they don't need to perform it. I have thought about that phone call many times since then, about what that man assumed when he dialed my number on a Wednesday evening. He assumed he was calling a retired tradesman with no particular leverage and no particular standing, a man who could be managed with a polite but firm conversation, a man who would nod and step aside because that is what men like me are supposed to do when men like him decide how things will be arranged. He was wrong, not because I am powerful in the way he measures power. I am not. I don't own jets or buildings in Manhattan or a seat on any board that matters to him. What I own is 47 years of showing up and keeping my word. And the relationships that come from a life lived that way don't appear on any balance sheet he has ever looked at. But they are real. They are more real, I would argue, than most of what he has spent his life accumulating. There is a kind of man who believes that importance is something conferred from above, that it flows from titles and square footage and the size of your guest list and the label inside your jacket. I understand that man because I have spent my life working around him. I have built things for him. I have watched him walk through the doors of buildings my crew poured their labor into, without once looking at the craftsmanship, without once thinking about the hands that made it. And there is another kind of man, the kind who knows that importance is something you build quietly, over a long time, with honest work and kept promises and the willingness to show up for people when there is nothing in it for you. The kind whose value is not visible at first glance, but becomes apparent when the structure is tested. I have always known which kind I am. I have never particularly cared whether anyone else recognized it. But I will say this. There is a certain satisfaction, quiet, without theater, the kind that settles in your chest. The way sawdust smells settle in a workshop in the moment when someone who thought they understood you discovers that they did not. Not satisfaction at their embarrassment. Not at the collapse of what they planned. The satisfaction is simpler than that. It is the satisfaction of a dovetail joint cut precisely, fitted cleanly, each piece holding the other in place with nothing but the geometry of its own making. No nails, no fasteners. Just two pieces of wood, shaped with patience and care, holding each other together because they were made to. That September, I finished the cabinet I had been building for my son's house. Walnut, hand-fitted, dovetail joints throughout. I brought it over the week after the wedding and set it in the corner of their living room where she had said she wanted it. She ran her hand along the top the same way I run my hand along wood in the workshop, feeling what's true about it. She said, "You built this yourself?" I said, "Took me most of the summer." She said, "It's beautiful." I said, "It'll last longer than both of us." She nodded. She understood, I think, that I wasn't only talking about the cabinet. My son's father-in-law and I have had 3 dinners since the wedding. He is not a changed man. I don't believe in the kind of transformation that happens in a single season, and I would be suspicious of anyone who claimed it. But he is a different man around me now. The handshake is still firm, but it stays a second or two longer than it used to. He asks real questions and listens to the answers. At the last dinner, he asked about my wife, unprompted, and listened to me talk about her for 20 minutes without checking his phone once. That's enough. You don't need a man to become someone else. You just need him to understand that the world is wider than the one he built for himself. My son and his wife are expecting their first child in the spring. A boy, they think, though they're keeping it as a surprise. I have started building a rocking horse in the workshop. Red oak, because red oak is honest wood. It doesn't pretend to be anything it isn't, and it holds up for generations if you treat it right. I work on it in the evenings, when the light in the garage comes in low and amber, and the sawdust rises in the air and settles on my hands, and I think about what I want to leave behind. Not money, not influence, not a seat at the right table or a name in the right rooms. I want to leave behind a grandson who understands that the measure of a person is not what they own, or who they know, or whether their guests make the right impression at the right events. I want to leave behind the knowledge that a quiet man is not a small man, that the most important people in a room are not always the ones who announce themselves, that a man who has spent his life building things knows something the other men don't. What you rush fails. What you cut corners on shows. What you build with care and patience and honest materials stands. I choose what I leave behind. I choose what I build. I choose what I call important. And I choose the people who will stand beside me when none of the other things matter anymore. That has always been enough for me. It always will be.